Hi guys, it's Rory here. Just wanted to leave a quick note to say that if you enjoyed last week's episode and want to keep up to date with the content that we release every week, please remember to follow or subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or whichever platform you're listening to us on. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify specifically, please also remember to leave us a review. It means a lot to us and does wonders for pushing our podcast in front of new listeners every week. Once you've done that, leave a comment on Spotify or come and join us on X, BlueSky, or Instagram and let us know that you've left a review. It means a whole lot to us and we'll make sure that we get in touch with you to say thank you. Thank you once again for listening. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I've got the pleasure of being joined once again by our good friend, Steven Torres.
Hello, Rory. It's great for you to have me once again on your podcast. I'm looking forward to this one. I'm sure it's going to be a very nice episode for your listeners.
Yes, I definitely think it will be. It's an episode that's kind of come out for a number of different reasons. Primarily, this episode is the verbal manifestation of a labour of love from Steven. A bit of a side project that's been going on for the last while, where he has effectively produced a report through ANCCIF, our partner organisation, into the US teams that competed in the early Champions Cup. Now, a lot of our listeners will know that tournament right now as the CONCACAF Champions Cup. Effectively, the closest comparison is to, the Champions League or the Copa Libertadores and CONMEBOL. But before it became the CONCACAF Champions Cup, it had such a rich and unique history, tracing all the way back to the 60s. Now, the curious thing, and this is where Steven and ANCCIF have came in, is that a number of the clubs that competed in this tournament didn't have their fixtures recorded. A lot of the records for those fixtures are incredibly vague. Some of them don't exist. Some of them are missing some really crucial details. And this is where Steven stepped in to produce a 49-page document on all of those early US teams who competed in the Champions Cup and how they matched up against the Mexican teams as well, which is something that we'll come on to speak about. But today we are going to be talking all about the history of the Champions Cup and a little bit of those clubs that actually competed in it. We could very easily go into a history of all the football clubs that actually did compete in these early tournaments. But for today, we're going to give a bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour around the different clubs that competed and some of the historic fixtures, as well as a bit of a background and context to the research that took place. Now, Steven Torres is the president of ANCCIF and a freelance communications and media expert. He's been on the podcast a number of times now. If you aren't familiar with Steven's work, then please go and check out our episodes on the New York Cosmos trip to Cuba, on the Football Investigators, or on North Jersey Professional Soccer if you'd like a little bit more in-depth information on who he is and the work that ANCCIF actually do. But let's just jump straight into things then. So tell us a little bit about the backstory to producing this document, Steven, because, just shy of 50 pages is a huge project to be doing on the side. And it's not even that, it's not just a case that you're just using a word processor to type things. You're collecting photos and collecting information when a huge amount of time has gone into this. So where did the idea come from? What's the backdrop and the context to this project?
Well, with this, we have to go straight to ANCCIF in the sense that obviously you mentioned earlier, I am the president of the organization since 2021. And we're a group of historians, but we've been divided into not just individuals from different parts of the region of North, Central America, and the Caribbean, and a few members of South America, is that we've taken the task of being part of 4 investigation committees within ANCCIF. And the investigation committees obviously are broken down into men and women's youth football, women's futsal, and beach soccer, and then club tournaments. Now, I am the president or the chairman of 2 committees, which is futsal and beach soccer, and this one, which is the club tournament ones. And this is just something that came about because in 2022, I did complete a 60-year anniversary of the Champions Cup tournament. And it just had a breakdown of all the respective champions running from 1962 the first tournament all the way to 2008. Remember, at the time, after 2008, I'm just jumping the gun a little bit, it was called the CONCACAF Champions League, which ran from 2008 until 2023. And then the old saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It returned to its original name of the CONCACAF Champions Cup in 2024. Now it's back to its original name. So having said that, I did complete the project. It was very informative. I think I did send you a copy of it. and it was well received within ANCCIF. I did have an opportunity to give a presentation to SASH, the Society of U.S. Historians. It needed to have some sort of a U.S. angle to it. So when I did the presentation the same year of 2022, at around April, to their respective delegates, I took a spin to it and decided, well, let me give it more of a U.S. angle, and let's talk about just the U.S. teams that competed. Going through it, I was really, surprised at how much information I had already had accumulated, because we're talking about the Champions Cup, each and every one of their respective games and match reports. During my time at CONCACAF, I was able to accumulate as much research in trying to piece together the tournament, because it was very lacking in some scores, match reports, lineups, etc. So, with the help of many of the ANCCIF members, we've been able to put together, I would have to say, just specifically the first tournament era from 1962 to 2008, possibly maybe 85% of a complete match reports data. So, which is pretty good. But I was amazed at how much we were missing from the U.S. angle. So I pitched the same presentation to the SASH respective historians. I did make it clear that I wanted some assistance on trying to get all this information. Didn't hear back. It was put on the shelf for about a little bit of a year. And then I said to myself, you know what? I have to complete this on my own. I'm going to start contacting, let's say, the other historians within the region of, North, Central America, and the Caribbean, because you were surprised that, you had a U.S. team going down to, let's say, for example, going down to Honduras. The reason why I got both match reports is because somehow the information was on the Honduran newspaper. You see what I mean? So you've got all the details. They may have butchered a couple of the names, but the details were there. A photo came from the historian from Honduras. I have to give credit where credit is due, most of those details. So that's how it started, and then I'm looking through the rosters, I'm looking through the list, and I'm just speaking in general. I just don't want to single out just one specific team. And I'm saying to myself, wow, let me contact if this player is still around. Okay. And I did get some, player feedback. A couple of them were mentioned on the acknowledgement page in the presentation. And it was just amazing how much details they had. Before 1997, the presentation goes back to the era from 1963 to 1996. Now, we're talking about way before the start of MLS teams competing. And then before 1997, I was amazed that, 25 U.S. clubs from 11 states across the nation had qualified for the Champions Cup. 18 of them were either champions or runners-up of the U.S. National Challenge Cup, known as the U.S. Open Cup. That was pretty much the USSF's qualification to most of these teams getting into the tournament, because many of the soccer leagues didn't pay too much attention to it. And if you want to get the comparison, the CONCACAF Champions Cup was formed in 1962, 1 year after the formation of CONCACAF, and it's still the longest running international competition in the region. But it matched the champions and the country's national associations, and it crowned the club champions, since 1962. So it's very similar, the comparison to, let's say, to what you have at the UEFA's Champions League, as well as CONMEBOL's Copa Libertadores.
We've said this quite a few times when we've spoken before, Stephen. I think what's important about this work is that, you're showing collaboration with other football associations and other similar people from different countries, but it's also shining a light and actually beginning to archive some of these important results. And I think the thing is, and what I'd reiterate to people, because it's often quite common within heritage and working within heritage, it can be due to budget constraints and it can be due to time constraints, capacity constraints and other things. But still a lot of the time there's this kind of arrogance where people say, well, we need to filter out what's not important. But these things are important. And eventually you end up with this imbalance where people know all about the things that are important, but nothing about the things that aren't. And then they want to know those things. They want to know about the unknowns. They want to know about the things that they don't know happened. It's part of the fascination of research, I think. Part of the mystery of it is actually finding something out new for yourself and then being able to show it to everyone else that you discovered this thing. So it's brilliant to be able to do that, and it's brilliant that you've actually then put it into a document that paints a wider picture of it as well. These aren't just results in isolation. This is how these teams performed throughout the early iterations of the tournament, and this is how they actually matched up against some of their counterparts from other countries. So it's a really, really interesting document, and we'll make it available to our listeners as well. I mean, like you said, this was obviously a huge undertaking. To do that requires a huge amount of time. In terms about the actual Champions Cup itself, obviously you've mentioned there that CONCACAF Champions Cup has been through a few name changes, and in terms of the document, we can go all the way back to 1962 and 1963 to actually trace the origins. But before the 60s, was there any sort of similar tournament of this nature for clubs in America to compete at? Because while the 60s, are quite significant periods of football history, particularly within the UK, in the US, soccer had been a little bit stop-start, and things were only starting to reorganise in certain ways, certainly not to the level that it was in Europe, for instance. So it's maybe a bit easy for us to take for granted that certain soccer infrastructures in the US just outright didn't exist, or they only existed at an amateur or kind of regional and local level. So was there any tournament like this before the 60s where clubs in the US competed?
Well, I mean, at the international level, there were probably some, local, friendlies here and there, and that's another chapter that I would like to get into with the club tournaments. Is there is sections of major competitions, official competitions, confederation tournaments, as well as friendlies, because it's a whole category of it. And you have to go back to what I said earlier, that CONCACAF is one of the the youngest, not the youngest, but one of the youngest confederations in the world, compared to, of course, UEFA and CONMEBOL. The thing is that their formation came about in 1961. They had to start acting like a confederation in the sense that you have your national competitions, and now you have your club competitions. So there was 2 unofficial tournaments, within the region that CONCACAF may or may not accept as part of its history, but because they were not part of or under the CONCACAF banner, okay, and they were competitions that were similar or front runner to the CONCACAF Champions Cup, because it involved club teams within Central America and the Caribbean. The U.S. did not take part. Remember, the project began in 1963 because that was the first time a U.S. team or a representative of the USSF went to compete in this tournament. And that was the New York Hungaria club team that won the 1962 U.S. National, or the U.S. Cup, U.S. Open Cup. But we'll get to that in a second. But going back to the 2 unofficial tournaments, there was one in 1959 and 1961, one by Olimpia of Honduras and Liga Deportiva Alajuelense of Costa Rica. So they involved club teams from Central America and the Caribbean, as well as there was a Mexican team that competed in the 59 tournament. But like I said, those were like front runners to eventually the first tournament, which took place in 1962. There wasn't a U.S. team that competed in that Champions Cup. That was actually won by Chivas of Guadalajara of Mexico. So the tournament has been dominated by Mexican club teams. There have been other teams that have emerged that were not Mexican sides that have won the Champions Cup. And some clubs take it seriously, others, they just there to compete. And what I've noticed is that during this era of 1963 to 1996, I noticed that the majority of those club teams from the U.S. were the U.S. Open Cup champions, most of them. If the U.S. Open Cup champion couldn't compete, then the runner-up would go up. I mean, there were some league champions that did receive their invitation or their qualifying berths. Not all the leagues during that period ignored it. A couple of them did take it seriously. Some teams, you had teams from the 3 teams coming from the American Soccer League, the second version of the American Soccer League, not the first version, but the second version. And of course, you've had a couple of teams coming from the American Professional Soccer League. Of course, there was a team from the North American Soccer League, which was the Rochester Lancers, the only North American Soccer League champion to go and compete. And they have an interesting story that's for another podcast. But when you had these teams competing, many of them, there wasn't an international fit calendar that CONCACAF placed. And that goes back to what the relationship, the U.S. Soccer Federation, or the name it had at the time with CONCACAF, because, CONCACAF, what they did was just they sent the invitations out. Listen, we need your champion. And if you can't, your champion, your league champion, or your runner-up to come and compete. Similar to what UEFA and CONMEBOL informs their respective tournaments, which has always been done. You have to send your champion. At the time, the U.S. Soccer Federation, in 1963, the only league that was still going, the North American Soccer League, was still not in gear. You had the American Soccer League, but many of those teams were, either amateur or semi-professional, and they also did double duties in competing in the Open Cup. So that's what the U.S. Soccer Federation had. They only had the Open Cup as their champion. So they would say, okay, the 1963, we're sending to New York, Hungary to go and compete. The draw was set, and they were matched up with the Mexican league champion at the time, which was Club Deportivo Oro. And surprisingly, I have the match reports of all the games from that respective series that they had, because that team went down to Mexico, and very few people knew this at the time, okay? But they were the first U.S. club team to compete in the Champions Cup, but they were also the first team to win on Mexican soil. And they were led by, you say it was the U.S. International. He only had one cap with the USSF, but it was Andy Matei, who was a prolific goal scorer at the time for that club. Remember, this club came from, at the time, the league was the German American Soccer League, which later became the Cosmopolitan Soccer League. It's a semi-professional amateur league that still exists today. I do want to take this opportunity to give kudos to the General Secretary, Bill Martz, who pretty much helped me complete this project with some last-minute details that I was able. So I do want to give him, a congrats and acknowledgement, because I don't think I would have finished this project with the missing details that I needed in order to complete it. So, because many of them were teams from the Cosmopolitan Soccer League coming from the late, early 70s straight to the 80s. So this was the league that still exists today. And I would say that they were the trailblazers of producing teams, because those teams were the ones that competed in the Open Cup. They were champions at the Open Cup, so they got their berth, and now they get a chance to compete against the big time teams.
I'm with you. Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating history. There's so much to it as well. There's kind of these little nuances and caveats to how soccer in the US worked at this time that's different to how we understand it as well. And that gives quite a good foundation for this story leading into the 60s, where you had all these teams from the US suddenly descending on the Champions Cup. Just before we jump into that, will Steven tell us a little bit about the Champions Cup itself? As I said earlier, it's had many name changes. You've already mentioned some of those. But generally speaking, this tournament's been around from the 60s, and it's had different eras, which I think has been defined by what it's been called at the time.
Yeah, true. Like I said, overall, it had different versions of its name. That's usually more towards the Spanish journalists, that they would call it, a different name, adding, like the club champions and winners of the champion. But eventually the overall name was always the CONCACAF Champions Cup. Okay. And like I said earlier, it went from 1962 until 2008, when CONCACAF decided that they wanted to change its format to something similar to a UEFA Champions League style. So they changed the name to a CONCACAF Champions League, and having more opportunities for more teams to compete, a bigger draw, and the possibility of having it similar to its a main tournament for its club teams, because the Gold Cup, going back to the CONCACAF Gold Cup, it's the main tournament for national teams at the time. This is before they also added the CONCACAF Nations League. But then you had that, so they wanted to make it to this. And they had a criteria. You had a certain criteria that certain club teams had to play in a certain amount of space stadiums. The games were televised. Going back to the Champions Cup, it was just local television. There wasn't a fixed international calendar given by CONCACAF by the teams. So it was just going back to 1962. I mean, this is the teams that they have that are competing. They did the draw. Okay, it has to be completed throughout the whole year. So it was just between the two, Team A, Team B, communicate with each other, see when you can play your fixture dates, and continue on. And because of that, there were many tournaments that overlapped to the following year.
Quite interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. I mean, I know the 1971 tournament overlapped to the 72 tournament because, you're crowning a champion from the year before in the following year. It's because of there wasn't a set date. And also hosting the tournament, some teams broke even, sometimes they just couldn't do the situation. That's what I noticed with many of the US club teams. They couldn't have the schedule to set up, okay, I can host and I can do this, or even travel. And it also conflicted on their respective season games. And many of them could not compete. They had to withdraw, despite them qualifying as a so-and-so, berth to this respective year's tournament. They had to withdraw, and they forfeited the matches to whatever the opponent was. And it's mentioned in some of these years. But I really want to highlight the U.S. teams that actually were successful. As I just mentioned, New York Hungaria was a successful run that they had, being just a semi-professional or more amateur team against, top giants at the time, which, you're playing against the defending Mexican League champion, which was Club Deportivo Oro. And then you're going to their home and you're walking away with a 3-2 victory. Many people didn't know that, you see.
Yes, I see where you're coming from. I'm guessing then a lot of the clubs, just based on what you said, a lot of the clubs from the US chose to either pull out or not compete or come home early because, well, it sounds like there was a bit of an issue with fixture scheduling, but it also sounds like they're looking at a number of teams who actually went to this tournament and then had to withdraw from their local leagues because of the cost implicated with it.
What I've looked through it, I'll give you just a quick example. A team that still exists today, which is the Philadelphia Ukrainian Nationals, okay? They qualified, not competed, but they qualified for the tournament on 2 occasions, okay? But here's the thing. The first occasion, okay, the first time they were scheduled to compete, they didn't step onto the field. They couldn't step on the field because their opponents withdrew. They were scheduled to play against Club America of Mexico in early January, but the club had other plans and then decided to not compete. That put the Ukrainians in the next round. So they didn't even have to step onto the pitch. They were going already ready to compete against another Mexican club, which was Chivas of Guadalajara. And they were set to compete against them in the summer. Okay, so look how much time they had to rest. But sadly, at the time, Chivas was under a 3-year suspension given by CONCACAF in Mexico. And this is research that I, with the assistance of many of the other historians, especially in Mexico, I do want to give credit where credit is due, is Eric Lugo, who is also a founding member of ANCCIF and a key member of our organization. And he's based in Mexico and was able to provide me the articles that backed up this story. So Chivas was suspended by both CONCACAF and Mexico for 3 years because they refused to play the final the year before. So they were under a suspension. Therefore, the Philadelphia Ukrainian Nationals, hey, you got another forfeit victory. You go on to another round. So they're not even stepping onto the field, and they're already 2 rounds into the tournament. See how ironic this thing is? It's just okay. But then sadly, it got to the point where they couldn't compete against the Cuban club, and both clubs had to withdraw. But this still goes into the record book officially, at least under the ANCCIF criteria, is that this team qualified for this tournament, but they didn't step onto the field. But they advanced 3 rounds.
Didn't kick a ball, but advanced 3 rounds. It is one of the unique caveats of tournaments in the Americas at this time, isn't it?
Of course. And I bet you that very few people that are fans of the Philadelphia Ukrainian Nationals do not have this information, do not know this information. And I will bet money on that. Maybe you might find some players from that era that are still around. Maybe you'll find some players that actually played for the team that went down and competed in 1967 against Alianza FC of El Salvador, played 2 games there. Those were the first 2 official matches, and Alianza advanced to the next round. But the thing is that few people don't know this information, and I think that was the whole purpose of this project, is to try to, and that's what ANCCIF is to investigate, to find out not so much the truth, but, hey, a lot of people didn't know that. I bet you most of these records U.S. Soccer did not have in on their story. Oh, yes, we did send the Philadelphia Ukrainian Nationals because on the so-and-so year, because they were the Open Cup champions from the year before.
Yeah, I'm with you. And the thing is as well, every so often you'll find out something about, maybe not your football club, but I'm quite lucky, obviously being from Scotland, that the history of our football teams is pretty well recorded, But every so often, you'll find out that another football club in Scotland, I don't know, for example, I found out last year that Stirling Albion were actually one of the very first clubs from the UK to play a friendly in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I didn't know that. I mean, that's very cool. It's something that a lot of Stirling fans actually do know, but not an awful lot of people out with that circle know about that. And what I find brilliant about this project, Stephen, that you've developed, is that it's actually adding substance to the history of a lot of football clubs that still exist. Let's not forget that a lot of these clubs are still around, or were the predecessor to a lot of football clubs that we see today, or even if there isn't a direct link, people can trace the lineage of the clubs through the place and the place name, because ultimately the heritage of these football clubs directly impacts the heritage of the football in these places today. I mean, you've already mentioned some big names. Rochester Rhinos, am I right in saying that they were one of the last non-professional clubs to win the Open Cup? I feel like I've got that stat from somewhere. That's an incredible football team with an incredible history. And you're the Rochester club going to compete at this tournament as well. Like, there's so much added to the history of these football clubs and how people can actually feel connected to their clubs, because you've not just uncovered the fixtures that have taken place and you've put it in the context of a wider tournament. It adds so much to football clubs for people when research like this takes place.
Yeah, I just want to add, just to be clear, you just mentioned the Rochester Rhinos, who were a team from the United Soccer League that had won the Open Cup. They did not get an opportunity to compete in the Champions Cup. I remember at the time, and we'll get to which was the last Open Cup berth given, because at the time, the league started to flourish. There were some professional teams that were getting the berths rather than the Open Cup. And it took a while until, I believe, the Dallas Rockets, who in 1992, I believe they were the last Open Cup representative, because they went in as the Open Cup runner-up from the year before in 91. So they went to the 92 tournament, okay? They were the last representative for an Open Cup berth, because I believe that it didn't go back to the Open Cup champion until 2003. And I recall that because during my time at US Soccer, and I remember that the Rochester Rhinos they wanted to compete in this tournament, but US Soccer did not designate the berth to it. They designated the berths to other teams, and at the time it was MLS. But like I said, that can be a debate for another time. But I was there at US Soccer, and I understood, the argument that the Rhinos had at the time, because they were the Open Cup champions. But the Rochester Lancers were a separate team from Rochester, of course, and they competed in the North American Soccer League. Yes, they were the team that competed in the 71 Champions Cup because they wanted to be there. I know that they had a huge backlash from the teams from the North American Soccer League. Michael Lewis wrote a book about the club of the Rochester Lancers and its history. And, there is a chapter of them competing in the Champions Cup. And of course, the backstory on what they had, what the North American Soccer League teams thought about it, because many of them, similar to the Open Cup, the teams from the North American Soccer League didn't take that tournament seriously. They didn't want to get embarrassed. Going to the achievements of some of the U.S. club teams, that same year was the first year that two teams from the U.S. qualified to the Champions Cup. Obviously, the Rochester Lancers as the champion of the North American Soccer League the year before, but you had Elizabeth Soccer Club, who was the Open Cup champion. When you said earlier about some teams withdrawing because of financial situation, schedule, conflict, etc., I wrote a nice piece about this for your website as well a while back. The Elizabeth Soccer Club, they're based in New Jersey. They don't exist anymore, but they've been around until the mid-1990s. They had a lot of history, of course. They're ready to play against Cruz Azul, who was the defending champion. It was just amazing how, you've got the defending champion from Mexico coming in, playing against this club. The team played to a scoreless draw in the first leg. Okay, so then you have Elizabeth Soccer Club ready to make a trip to the return leg in Mexico, and guess what happens? Mexican League goes on strike. You have these players they have their own jobs elsewhere. Okay, so they play with this club, and they've already asked for time off to play the second leg. Now, they've asked that the club ask CONCACAF to reschedule it, but they can't guarantee that these players are going to have the days off, so they had no choice but to withdraw. That's one of the other reasons why a club team withdrew.
That's quite interesting. I'm with you. Yeah, it's one of those tournaments across. I get what you're saying. It kind of crossed so many different league caveats because a lot of these leagues were regional, some of them were national. That sometimes it's kind of like how a lot of Irish clubs in 2025, if they qualify for Europe because they play a summer league, it's Europe for the following season, if that makes sense. Tell us some stories about some of the other clubs that competed as well, some of the other successes. Obviously, you mentioned Rochester there.
Sure, fantastic. Well, I was amazed that, and I think I had a conversation with you offline about this one, was the club team, the Brooklyn Dodgers. Obviously, they're known as the Brooklyn Italians. There was a period, and I think this would be something that maybe you may want to have Bill Mertz from the Cosmopolitan Soccer League give more details. But there was a period that, remember, the Cosmopolitan Soccer League was such an ethnic league with teams that gone with their names. You had, Brooklyn Italians, the New York Greek Americans, the other one was the New York Participian Freedoms, all teams that had qualified as champions of not just the Cosmopolitan Soccer League, but they were champions in the Open Cup and competed in this tournament. So going back to the Brooklyn Dodgers, which they were known at the time, but the franchise is now known as the Brooklyn Italians. Their first appearance in the tournament was really interesting because the thing is that they go in after they eliminated a Bermudan club called Hotels International FC. So then, of course, they're paired up against Cruz Azul, who has a reputation in this tournament. The quick story for them is that, I know obviously they lost both games. After losing the first game in Mexico, they decide to host Cruz Azul at Giants Stadium, the old Giants Stadium out in East Rutherford, New Jersey. That was at the time the home of the New York Cosmos. So I found out that, wow, it's actually a doubleheader that's taking place. The first game is Brooklyn Dodgers against Cruz Azul, and then the second game, it's the Cosmos are hosting the LA Aztecs in a playoff match. But the attendance in that day was 42,324. Very few people know that was the highest attendance that a U.S. club team at the tournament at that time had, until it was broken probably years later by probably one of the MLS teams. But it stood there for a while, but that was the home attendance. The sad thing about the game against Cruz Azul against the Dodgers, yes, Cruz Azul won the series. They won the game 3-2, but sadly the Brooklyn Dodgers missed 3 penalty kicks in that game. So, you got to have a little bit luck on your shoulders, but another team that I mentioned earlier, the New York Participian Freedoms, made their debut in the tournament in 82. Ironically, they were the champions of the Open Cup in 1980, but for some apparent reason, they couldn't compete in the Champions Cup of 81, but were given permission by the USSF to compete in the 82 tournament. So this was 2 years after they had lifted the trophy. So after they played a series, surprisingly, against the Brooklyn Dodgers, which was the first ever U.S.-only club matchup at the time, for many years I thought, and even in the CONCACAF archives, that their next opponent was Pumas of Mexico, which obviously could not compete because they had to withdraw because of their scheduling conflict. But then after speaking to the now president or still owner of the New York Participian Freedoms, he mentioned to me and he said, "You forgot to list these games that they played against Club Deportivo FAS of El Salvador." I go, "Excuse me? You played against FAS these 2 games?" That same year. It's not even in the CONCACAF records. It was not even mentioned. So I had to go and do the research and found out that they did play 2 games there against them, won both games. So it was just shocking that record was not in the archives of CONCACAF. That amazed me that I was able to find the scores and the goal scorers of that specific game. And still with the Participian Freedoms that specific year, and they did compete in 83. They went on and competed for a 3rd consecutive year in 84. That was probably their most successful year at the time by a U.S. team. It eliminated, once again, Hotels Internationals FC. Then the second round, they went to a penalty kick shootout to eliminate Puebla of Mexico. This is 1984 here. So Puebla of Mexico is sent home by the Participian Freedoms. Then they eliminate another club. This one is from Honduras called Club Deportivo Vida. Once again, it was on the penalty kick shootout. So they were on a roll. Their goalkeeper was on a roll, going in, eliminating 3 opponents from 3 different countries on the PK shootout after the 2-game series were tied. Then came the infamous matchup against the matchup that was supposed to be taking place against Chivas of Guadalajara that year. There was back and forth between the two. This was done with so much investigation. It's not even funny. Everybody knows that both teams were disqualified, and then the Haitian club, Violet AC, was declared the champion of that year. But the tournament, like I said, overlapped from 84 all the way to 85 because Chivas and the New York Participian Freedom could not agree on a date to play the matches. So it got to the point where, okay, CONCACAF gave them the ultimatum. You're going to play 1 game at the Memorial Coliseum. We need the winner to play Violet, who is the Caribbean champion. It was postponed several times. They tried to play it in February 26th. It was not accepted by CONCACAF, so CONCACAF had no choice but to disqualify both teams. So that's the closest at the time a U.S. team got to reaching a final of a tournament. And it was on a technicality. It was something that I think that could have been resolved, and it could not happen today because you have fixture dates ahead of time. Many people thought, and even I, during that specific year, that the New York Participian Freedoms were the only U.S. team competing that year at the Champions Cup. But then, out of the blue, I find out from a historian from Panama who sends me these details. Hey, listen, the Jacksonville T-Men played against Sirilanko FC of Panama that same year. Okay, was it a friendly series? No, it was the part of the Champions Cup. I can't believe that these 2 games were not part of the history or the tournament brackets. And there were a lot of incomplete games that I was able to find and correct them. I mean, that's part of what ANCCIF does.
Yeah, you're right. And I just want to bring it back, Stephen, to something that you said a little bit earlier on, that you were kind of shocked that a lot of these things weren't recorded within the CONCACAF archives. I know, obviously, even with associations in Europe, we're still discovering something almost every day new about football, regardless how minor it is. And sometimes it can be down to, this is something that's been lost, or the archive has been misplaced, or something along those lines. But whenever we spoke, and again, for our listeners who haven't already, I encourage you to go back to listen to the 3 other episodes we've had Stephen on this year. Stephen has mentioned quite a lot how CONCACAF seemed to have a real sort of gap within their archives of this kind of information, which is really the reason that ANCCIF exists, to try and bridge this gap, and to try and actually fill them as well, to bring them to people such as this project. But why do you think that it is that CONCACAF, 1, don't have this information, Stephen, and 2, don't seem to be doing very much to go out and find it?
I mean, this is just my opinion, but I can only speak on behalf of what I saw, especially during my time working there. I mean, when I came in, I was already a huge fan of the historical content of certain tournaments, and I had the strong background coming from the U.S. Soccer Federation. I mean, the offices were based at the time in New York. The thing is that CONCACAF had its previous, general secretary offices were based in Guatemala City. So when there was, I guess, the transition of new presidents, new general secretaries being named, then, of course, the transition of the information and, I guess, the history was, I guess, not considered important for it to be transferred from what in Central America to up north, based now in the offices in New York. Now, I'm not saying not all of it, but that's just what I saw. Okay. So even during my time there, I was able to piece together what I can get. And I had many conversations and many meetings with, historical journalists. I did meet with the former general secretary or deputy general secretary during that era in Guatemala, who had a huge library of content. And at the time, what I was doing was trying to piece together its history. I was trying to piece together, previous, not just the Champions Cup, but, previous youth tournaments. Anything that was before 1990 was very difficult to obtain. And we're looking at from 1961 all the way to 1989. That's a lot of events. That's a lot of tournaments. That's a lot of competitions. Other than World Cup qualifying, which you could find, I guess pretty easily, it was very difficult to get a few, match reports. And like I said earlier, many of the members of ANCCIF are former or, journalists, also key historians in their respective countries. They all have, at least from their perspective, some history from their national team, from their countries, from their clubs. So the whole point was to try to unify everything. Hey, listen, if you've got details from all the Guatemalan teams that competed in these competitions, share it with what I have here, and then you've got a center base. The Caribbean was, and to this day, is still a little bit difficult to obtain because you can find very few historians, and ANCCIF wants to change that, of course. That's one of the things that ANCCIF likes to do. That's what I noticed, that maybe that wasn't the part of the transitional period. Now, the other part that you mentioned on what CONCACAF is doing moving forward, I mean, I can only speak from what I see, and you'd be surprised. A lot of people are interested to go, and they want to go. When it comes to the Gold Cup, I've gotten so many people even asking me, Steve, you used to have the previous tournaments in a section, which was the archive section on the CONCACAF website. We can't find anything on what was Trinidad and Tobago's first appearance at a Gold Cup, who scored in that game. I'm just throwing out simple details, but simple requests like that. People want to know what happened in the previous years, not just for national teams, but also for club events. And with this document, it just starts a turning point and a speaking point, because you can actually build this into more details of all the club teams and the club names that competed under the banner of the USSF against other club teams in this tournament.
Yeah, it's just incredible stuff. And I think for me, what's important about this document is that it provides a framework for other people who want to do similar. It provides people a reference if they want to go and try and have a go at publishing some of the results of their research, the fruits of their labour, or some of the discoveries that they've made relating to this kind of unknown or undiscovered football history, because it's incredibly important. And I think the more people who are actually working on these kind of projects, but know how to publish them as well, because let's be honest, trying to organise and deliver, even just publish any major project like this, actually putting it out there for people to see as a huge amount of work, can be incredibly daunting as well. So it's always good for people to see good examples of it being done, and just a bit of a framework for how you can actually do it as well, I think. And that's what's great about this document, is that it provides all that for people, and it allows them to be able to go and do similar.
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, this tournament has its rich history, and you can probably do something similar with any other of the countries. Like, what were the Costa Rican club teams, or it's already may have been done. I don't know, but I'm just throwing as an example. What were the Costa Rican teams that competed in the Champions Cup and their success in the event? Okay, the same thing with the Mexican club teams, but of course, everybody knows that they usually fare well in these events because they go in with an attitude that they want to be the best, and they capture the tournament. It goes not just whatever the name it is. If they call it the Champions Cup and they call it the Champions League, many of the club teams do take it as serious as possible, as I'm sure it's done in UEFA for the Champions League, as well as the Libertadores in CONMEBOL. And it goes back to what I said earlier, is that this project can open up more and more details. The one thing I do wanted to do as a second phase of this project is to add the complete match report details for all the teams. I can say I pretty much have maybe 90% of all the match reports, and that's pretty good. Maybe somebody wants to know, was there a team that competed from this era? Very few people know that, there were teams from California that qualified to the Champions Cup, but sadly they didn't compete. And I know that the last year that there was not a club team competing in the Champions Cup was in 1995. Okay. Since then, there's always been a U.S. representative followed, because, 96, of course, it was surprisingly the Seattle Sounders were the representatives in the 96 tournament, which again overlapped to the following year. But it was the Seattle Sounders that were competing in the A-League at the time. They were not part of MLS. they reemerged from, being the club team from the NASL, but they didn't compete under that banner. So they shouldn't be counted similar to what the Rochester Lancers did, because they did compete under the banner of the North American Soccer League.
Yeah.
The project concludes with that being the Founders being the last team. Then you have the MLS teams starting to compete in '97, and since then but it was just amazing. And I do want to point out the '89 St. Louis Bush Seniors, who had competed, having won the Open Cup the year before. It was a while since a team actually beat a Mexican side during the 90 minutes regulations, and it was them. They beat the team of Universidad of Guadalajara in a small little soccer park in Fenton, Missouri. Of course, they lost the series, but, I was surprised at looking at the game report, looking at the photos from that game, and I go, wow, this was, the first time, a U.S. team defeated a Mexican club team since on the field in regulation since '63. That was the highlight. And then '92, I think, was, if you don't count the years of MLS, was probably a very banner year for the U.S. teams in the tournament. And the reason why I say that is because I mentioned earlier the Dallas Rockets were the team that competed as the runner-up of the '91 Open Cup. The champion at the time was the Brooklyn Italians, but they did not withdraw. They just took an invitation to compete in another CONCACAF tournament, which was the Cup Winners' Cup. So Dallas took their place. But then you had, the American Professional Soccer League winner, the San Francisco Bay Blackhawks, competing. And these two teams, the Dallas Rockets and the San Francisco Bay Blackhawks, had stellar runs in the tournament. Each of them eliminated 3 different club teams on their way to the third round. Sadly, they were both eliminated by the same club, Mexican side, which was Club America, in a very thrilling series, both of them. The thing was that they were eliminated with the eventual champion was Club America. So I think that year was probably the best year for U.S. club teams in the tournament because they had a very stellar run. They were taking it seriously. They went right after who was ever their opponents. And yeah, it was just, you could say, one of the key successes of those club teams. And taking in account that all the teams that competed and that are in this presentation, I consider them pretty much trailblazers. They set the foundation to what now MLS club teams have the opportunity to compete. Now, I'm not saying that they've had better success or too much better success. There's only been 3 MLS teams to lift a trophy from CONCACAF since 1997, compared to how many championship rings other clubs have. It's getting better, but you have to give credit with due. And I would say these were the front runners and the trailblazers that set a foundation for what these new clubs now have the opportunity to do.
Yes. And I think what's incredible as well is that, these clubs stood up pretty well against some of the strongest Mexican football clubs that are still, massive powerhouses within the Mexican game today. These clubs went toe-to-toe with them, especially when you consider the actual pedigree of this tournament and what it would go on to become. So, yeah, it's an absolutely magnificent achievement, Stephen, to be able to have produced something to this level. Like you said, you do have a second phase planned for this particular project, but I wondered if once that phase 2 is complete, what your next project of this kind is going to be, what's it going to look like, and what eras or competitions or clubs is it going to cover?
Well, like I said earlier, I think I spent a lot of time on this one. I consider the second phase of this being what's the comparison I can say is maybe a little icing on the cake if I am able to get the missing match report details that I need, which is, like I said, I've got 90% of it done. So if I get the full 100, then you'll get a second version of this document truly updated. But some of that information needs to come from the clubs that are still around. I know that they're still in season. They're still, they have other projects to work on. And of course, maybe its history is something that they would want to just mention on an article here and there. But, I just appeal to them in the sense that it's as I said earlier, they are trailblazers. They are the front runners of now what the other professional teams are doing with other clubs. Because we're talking about an era where there was a period where, the U.S. men's national team hadn't qualified for a World Cup until 1989. So during that period, there was, the international game needed to start somewhere, let be not just at the youth level, but also at the national team level. And most of these players, it was the league that these clubs represented. That would be part of another project. The overall project would be to get as many more countries and their history in this type of tournament, but not just the Champions Cup. Like I said earlier, there was another tournament called the Club Winners' Cup, which was given to the champions of the cup competitions, very similar to some other tournaments in other confederations. And it ran from 91 until 1997, and that was it. CONCACAF decided not to continue the tournament. Maybe it would be something that they would want to do in the future. Going back to the Champions Cup itself, I put out something to celebrate its 60 years, but you'd be surprised how many match reports are still missing. But then you've got that, specifically just in the club tournament level, other participations in other competitions, and even the friendlies. It's a nonstop research and all. And like I said, that I'm also the president of the investigation committee for beach soccer and futsal. I'm also doing the same on the respective competitions for those respective tournaments, and which is obviously, I wouldn't say a little bit easier, but those competitions have started in the 1990s, so it makes it a little bit easier to track down details and information from that. I usually like a challenge, and the challenge I like is anything before 1990, because once you have the information, then you can say, okay, here it is. Let's present it. Let's educate. So ANCCIF is doing its job to try to be as informative as possible.
And it's been a great education for me, this talk, just to learn a little bit more again about, I always say, the early history of soccer in the US. The US has an incredible history of soccer that goes back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, like other nations in Europe do, but people often forget that. People need to know about it, and the reason that I often get you on, Steven, is so that I can be educated in this as well, because it's great hearing this information that previously was undiscovered or unknown or had left living memory. And it's fantastic that a publication surrounding that research has been able to come out. I mean, is there anything else that you'd like to add just before we finish up for today?
Well, listen, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to having me on the show once again. There's a lot of details here that you want to talk about, but it's best to allow someone just to look through the document, as you mentioned earlier. It's a work in progress. I do open the doors to anyone that wants to, that will listen in and say, well, wait a minute, I may have something more that I can contribute. I'll take any type of details or corrections if need be, because I want to get this thing completed and done, and then we can move on to the next one. But I do want to thank you for having me the opportunity to show at least the key details of this respective research. I'm sure you'll get many more of these to come.
Yeah, I mean, like you said earlier on, every single club in this publication, you could have a separate podcast episode in each of them. At some stage we probably will, or at least we'll attempt to chip away at that, probably in the new year. And on that note, I would just like to thank you, Steven, for consistently coming on to the podcast, connecting us with some incredible individuals, Eric Stover, Tom McCabe, Dr. David Kilpatrick, for some of the episodes that we've done. By the time this episode comes out, we're only going to have 5 episodes left of 2025. At that point, we will take our winter break and start putting things in place for our podcast and everything else for 2026. So this is the last time you'll be on the podcast this year, Steven. So again, just wanted to thank you very much for providing what has been an absolutely incredible partnership, our first year of it with ANCCIF. It's been incredibly fruitful. We've done a huge amount for each other, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what we can develop and actually bring out in 2026 as well.
Well, thank you once again for having me. It's been a pleasure. It's a true, blessing, obviously, that the partnership that, Football Heritage and ANCCIF has, and we look forward to even better things in the new year.
Absolutely. I think that'll do us for just now, Steven. That was a really great chat. Thank you very much once again for coming on. Thank you very much once again to all of our listeners who tuned into this episode. If there is anything else that you want to ask about this episode, if you want to reach out to discuss an episode yourself, as just mentioned, we're probably looking at 2026 now, as we're all booked up until the end of our podcast run for 2025, then please do get in touch. You can DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can also email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. Stephen, say goodbye.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
That's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.